Well, thank you very much. Wonderful to be here, and I want to say thanks to our beloved minister, one of our dear clients, and also to my colleagues in the IGC who extended this invitation to me. I had to say I wasn't very familiar with their work until a few years ago, and I'm very impressed by what you do. And what Jonathan described this morning is just a confirmation of what I had sensed through my colleagues that work all over Africa, but also through the products that I have read coming out of your team. So I had to take my hat off to all of you. Let me say this panel couldn't be more timely. There is no question that Africa is entering a new commodity bonanza, a new natural resource bonanza. This one is different, not just because it's high in prices. I think this bonanza will be driven by quantities. The technology for exploration, extraction, and exportation of natural resources, oil, gas, minerals, is so much cheaper, faster, and cleaner than it was in the past, that what we think today is that what we see in the continent is only about 10% of what is actually there. My colleagues that are much more knowledgeable than me in this area say that they can fly now airplanes that carry, don't laugh about it, a big metal ball hanging from the back called the MAD, the Magnetic Anomaly Detector, and that can tell you exactly what is underground, up to 200 meters underground. And by their calculation, they feel that about 90% of the natural resources are yet to be discovered. And when they are discovered this time around, the information will be socialized, which makes a tremendous difference from the past, quantity-wise, because it's not information that an explorer has and doesn't want to share with the government. You have an asymmetry there. It's information that everybody will have, and the balance sheet of governments, particular governments, will be stronger in front of the markets. It won't just be a claim, it will be actual resources underground. So we know that in the context that we are entering into a second bonanza, that this one will be driven by quantities. The bad news, of course, is that there were bonanzas before, in the 70s and early 80s. And by and large, those bonanzas were wasted. If I can see, okay, there you go. I'm going to show two, and only two, pieces of evidence. There is much more than this. You can see here that African countries that have been enjoying massive natural resource rent do very poorly in indicators that are fairly now manageable. Child mortality, under 5 child mortality, is something that we know how to deal with. You can't say that money is the issue anymore. And the same with life expectancy. You know, you see now the reverse. These countries are the ones that perform the worst. It's interesting, you know, if you compare, I don't know, Angola with Tajikistan, for the same GNI per capita, how one can get people to live a lot longer than the other. So I don't think there is any doubt that the past bonanza wasn't exploited to the maximum, to put it mildly. You know, if anything, it was wasted. And that triggered gigantic literature as to why that happened. I have to say, by now, the consensus, after you pass through the symptoms, like the Dutch disease and the corruption, all those are symptoms. When the consensus boils down to a simple truth, and is that the natural resource rent goes directly from the ground to the government. The citizen never sees it, okay? And that weakens the fundamental social contract on which nations are based, which is, me, government, will tax you, citizen, and in exchange I will give you services. The first service will be your physical and personal security. That's how societies and civilizations came to be. Today is a little more than those services. They will say, I will give you education, I will give you health. But because you pay me taxes, you will be pestering me that I do give you the services. And if I don't, you will kick me out of government. Hopefully you will have means to do that. Now that truth is very real for the citizen in the street. No? There are 5 degrees of separation between you. Think about you personally, if you come from a country that is rich in natural resources, and start counting how many degrees of separation there are between oil and you, personally. Okay? At the moment that the Minister of Oil grants a license to a company to start exploring a certain part of your country, he or she does not talk to you. Okay? That is one separation point. I don't remember me being consulted ever whether my country was given a license or not. Then comes the company itself that decides how to extract, how deep, how much, how fast. They don't talk to you. Then comes the Minister of Finance, some, not a brilliance like Maria, that put together a budget with the money that they project is going to come from these natural resources, and they don't talk to you either. Then that budget goes to Parliament, and here is where the politicians supposedly should talk to you. But raise your hands the last time they did. And you say, well, if they don't, I fire them. Well, that doesn't work that straightforward. That's the 4th degrees of separation. And then comes a Minister of Sector, maybe a Minister of Education, that decides which school to build, or not to build a school and spend the money in teachers. When we say the money went to education, and this is nice to say, but every time I see money going to education, this is salaries. Okay? This is not results. I would like to see claims that this new wave of resource money will go to educational outcomes. I'll pay for words per minute that the children can read. I don't pay just salaries. Anyway, when the Minister of Education has to make that decision on where to build the school and how, he doesn't talk to you. So at the end of the line, a little kid, you, walks into the school and somebody maybe says, this school was built with your oil money, your money. 5 degrees of separation. It's a reality that that's what happens. So remember, a bonanza got wasted, a new bonanza coming in, we know the fundamental cause, not the symptoms, the cause, which is the separation between the resource and the people, and what that does to the performance of the government. So naturally now we are all looking for ways to bring the people into the process. You know, to do exactly what we did last time, which is to try to build rules and institutions, is good. We shouldn't stop doing that. That's necessary, but it's by far not sufficient. We are going to repeat this 20 years from now. We should have built rules and institutions once the bonanza is gone, as we are doing it now. So the question is, why do we expect a different result if we do the same thing? Shouldn't we add one more ingredient to the pie, at least one more, to see what comes out? And that one more ingredient, the literature is saying, ought to be to bring the citizen to the decision-making around natural resources. Now, how to do that is everybody's guess. I'm going to talk about 3, actually I'm going to talk about 1, but I'm going to mention 3 proposals that are flying out there. One is just plain information. Keep them informed, tell them. No? Go out there and say, we discovered oil, this is the contract, I just published the contract, I'm totally transparent. Just be crystal clear with them. Well, we have some evidence as to where or what impact that kind of information has and does not have on where in the distribution of income you sit, meaning whether you are rich or poor. There is very good research out of MIT these days, mostly based on randomized control trials, which are of course very narrow because they go to a certain place at a certain point in time and do a certain thing. So it cannot be easily generalized. But essentially the research says people have a given mental bandwidth, meaning we can take so many things in our head at each point in time. No? My wife says always, men can only do one thing. No? They can't think of one thing. Women can think of many things, she says. Anyway, that bandwidth is limited, the new research says. And because it's limited, one particular situation can absorb it completely. And one of those situations that can absorb your bandwidth completely is poverty. The research seems to show, and this is from many RCTs, randomized controlled trials, that the poor's bandwidth is taken. So you can go and tell them, here is a new contract, that I signed with this company, and the percentage that I'm going to be saving, and you can tell them everything. People today at that level want to eat, okay? And that's the priority. So you may not have a change in behaviors out of information, simply because the bandwidth is taken. So that's one line of thought. The second line of thought to bring people into natural resources is participatory budgets. And I saw the name Peru there. And the Peruvians, to me, are the most advanced in this. I used to be the country director for the Andean countries, all the way from Bolivia to Venezuela. And the Peruvians decided to define the so-called social infrastructure piece of the budget that was paid with royalties from mining. It's a big mining place. And that social infrastructure budget, by law, had to be implemented by the municipalities, not even by the provinces. And the municipalities, by law, had to consult, that was the word, it's still the word, with the so-called mesas de pobreza, meaning poverty tables. It's a bad name, in my opinion, but that's how they call them. And essentially, local leaders and people had the chance to stand up there and say, this year the money we want to spend on fixing certain road or in a certain part of the municipality. And you were heard, and you still are heard. It's very nice to see. I witnessed many of these. People stand up and say, the school's roof leaks, fix it. Priority number one. So it's very difficult if everybody says that, then for the mayor to ignore it. So that's the second way to do participatory budgeting. I'm not sure how much you can do with that because the money will be so large in this bonanza for most of these countries that it's going to be very difficult to pull enough people at the local level to do this. We'll see. I mean, Kenya is on its way. The decentralization in Kenya will take a huge chunk of the new money that will come one day to be decided very locally. So we'll see what happens. But then the third way to bring people into, or link people to natural resources is the idea of making people plain shareholders of the companies that extract the resources, okay? Make the citizen receive dividends, okay? Now this idea, which is not new, essentially says, I, government, will give everybody here in my country, uniformly and universally, rich and poor, say 10% of the natural resource fiscal revenue that I get every year. You get a debit card, you carry it in your pocket, and the debit card will all of a sudden get loaded with 10% divided by the number of people in your country, okay? I will tell you how much money that would be per African country in a few minutes if you stay on. Some of you are already salivating, I can see. Well, we will come to it, but that's the idea, to make people shareholders. Now, this idea is not new, but it's not old either. It's only 10 years. I think I'm going to show quickly the papers that I know exist. I have researched this quite a bit. But more importantly, there's not many practices of this. There's only 2 places in the world that do this, as far as I know. One is Alaska. They've been doing that from the mid-80s out of the Alaska Permanent Fund, and it's on the residential basis. If you live there physically, you get it, and you get it through the tax system. There's no debit card. And the latest case is Iran, of all places, that used it to convince the society, the Iranian society, that gasoline fuels were a terrible thing. So they say, we will stop the gasoline fuel subsidy, we will charge full price for this gasoline over time, and in exchange you will get a debit card to which you are going to be transferred part of the revenue, the dividend, the profit of our oil company. That's essentially how the deal is. So there's not much in terms of literature. Why so little if it is such an appealing idea? Well, because there were so many reasons why you couldn't do this. Basically, there are many reasons why you couldn't do this. And what I'm going to claim today is that none of those reasons holds anymore. So you will have to find new reasons not to do it. The first reason was identification. It's too costly. To find somebody and give money requires to first find out who you are. Do you exist? Remember, the idea of transferring money to people in cash started 15 years ago in Mexico. I was there, I was the lead economist for Mexico. And I remember everybody except the president and the director of the budget was against the idea. Why? Because it was going to be impossible to find out who was who. But it was a beautiful thing because it forced the Mexican state to meet Pedro and Pablo and Maria individually. And then to say, do you exist? And the person say, physically yes, legally no, I have no birth certificate. So you have to fix that problem because you will never sign a contract, go to college, own a property. You won't exist economically speaking. So all of a sudden, they had a problem that they had to solve, a logistical problem. This is 15 years ago. Today, 70 countries in the world, developing world, 70 countries in the developing world, 35 of which in Africa, have already cash transfer programs, meaning have forced themselves to meet people individually. The technology for it has improved so much that now it's impossible to recognize what we used to do before and what we do today. Think about what India is doing with the biometric identification. They shine a light on your eyes. They read your iris. It takes about 30 seconds. The information goes up to the satellite, down to a mainframe, and now you exist. And if you didn't exist before, the feeling is great. Now, this business takes about 4 minutes per person, and it costs $4. And the Indians managed to identify 400 million Indians in the last 4 years. The Kenyans identify 1/3 of all Kenyans that vote, the voting bloc, in the 3 months right before the last election. So this thing is cheap and doable and fast, and it's going to get cheaper and more doable and faster. That excuse is no longer. Now the second excuse, which is powerful one, is if you take money away from the government, you are taking away money from public goods. The government will have less money to build roads and schools and vaccinate. You will defund the government. And I couldn't agree more with that. That's mathematically true. It's economically wrong. Why? Because this depends on the form or the production function for public goods. If the production function of public goods has diminishing returns to scale, and it is affected in its position, if you want, in its parametric position, by the amount of scrutiny by citizens, then you may very well distribute money away and get more public goods than before. Okay? Now, I'm going to explain this in a simple example, and then I'm going to show you a few charts just to show that the World Bank still does some mathematics. Okay? But the example is very plain, and it's very personal. And I want you to think about yourselves. Going home tonight, arriving home tired, you've been in the bank, in the conference, listening to the World Bank, and by the time you get home, you're thinking about your pajama, your slippers, and your wife or your girlfriend or your husband or your boyfriend open the door and say, honey, close your eyes. And you say, I'm not for games tonight, I want to rest. The World Bank just exhausted me. Say, no, please close your eyes. And you do close your eyes. And she takes you to the garage. Okay? And then she says, open your eyes. And when you open your eyes, what you see in the garage, right in front of your own eyes, is this beautiful, brand new, red color Ferrari Testarossa. Okay? Think about it, yeah? Imagine this. You go home tonight, you see the Ferrari there. What's your first thought? What comes to your mind? And I did some research about this, what comes to people's minds. If you're a man, the first thing that comes to your mind is, I'm very good, she loves me. I must be fantastic. If you're a woman, the first thing you think is, he must have done something very bad. He must have done something terrible. But the second thought, no matter your gender, is, where does this money come from? I didn't know we had this money. Jesus Christ, I mean, honey, where do you get this money from? No? Well, now think about it. All of a sudden, you get 10%, and you are told this is 10% of the oil revenue of your country. What's going to be your first question? What's happening with the other 90%? Well, that mathematically, that shows like this. Quickly. Okay, let me go very quickly. You don't need to read this. Okay? Now, it is a production function of public goods. The more revenue, the more public goods. But there is a point in which throwing more money doesn't generate more public goods. Okay? So that could be point EH. Okay? Now, if I now take money away from you and give it away, 10% of your revenue, remember, you are going to have less money, meaning less public goods, but at the same time, people are going to scrutinize you more. Per dollar you spend, you will achieve more. So you may very well end up in a point like that. Okay? You may end up with less money invested in public goods and more public goods being produced. That's the effect of your Ferrari. Okay? Now, I can talk on this forever, of course, but before Maria throws me out, I have a few minutes, so let me go back to these reasons, because there's a couple more reasons that I want you to be aware of. Politicians will have no incentive. Why? Because they want control. If I'm the president, I don't want to give up that control. I want to decide who gets what. This is the bottom line of incumbency. And I'm doing some research with a genial political scientist from Berkeley, very young guy. And he worked out the mathematics of this, and basically he says it all boils down to the value of the incumbency. Okay? Meaning, if I can decide over a lot of money, I won't ever give it up. So this agenda only works for a desperate opposition. Why desperate? Well, because if you as an opposition think that you're going to win, you may not offer this in your agenda, because you will get to government and then you want to have control on the oil or on the gold. Now, if you think about it, this proposal did come up in a desperate opposition situation, which is opposition in Venezuela. They came up with this idea. They make people the shareholders of PDVSA with a debit card called Mi Negra. That was the name of this card. It was going to be a black card that you want to carry in your pocket. Anyway, be that as it may, you may say, well, then it will never happen because there's no incentive. The opposition has to be so desperate to offer this. I don't know. Ask yourself why Mexico ever decided to give cash to the poor citizens. That was a loss of power, right? Why would they decide to do that? And they knew that once they did it, they couldn't withdraw it. It was going to take forever, as it did. Now, for whatever reason it happened, you might say that was an enlightened leadership that jumped on it, and indeed it was. Remember, the president at the time was an accidental president. He was an academic that became president because the candidate got shot and killed. So you may say, well, it was a pure luck. You had to have luck for somebody to get that illumination. The truth is, once one country does it, it's impossible for the neighbors not to do it. Within 5 years, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, everybody had done it. Everybody had to have a cash transfer program. Why? Because the citizens see it. Okay? So the prediction is, it doesn't really matter whether today you see political systems that do not lend themselves to this. It will just take one for this to spread. That's a prediction, but may not prove right. Anyway, there are many other reasons. There is, of course, the reason that this is bad for macroeconomic purposes because it will cause Dutch disease. Once you give money to people, they will consume it. Bad macroeconomics. Well, not true. And why? Because it depends where the money is going in the first place. If the money is given through public sector salaries, it's the same effect. It's going to go through consumption. So it's already a balance of payment problem. It's not like you are going to exacerbate the problem. And the idea that the poor are going to just drink up the money, no RCT proves that. On the contrary, you know the first thing that people tend to do when they have this kind of money? Put it in the children education. Now, qualify that. Most of these cash transfers go to women at the moment, and they tend to invest more in education. So I'm not sure that the macroeconomic impact that we expect is going to happen. Then the nationalization debate is the other one, saying this belongs to the nation. No? Yeah, right. No question about this. You're just going to recognize that. Now, at the same time, I ask you a question. If you were to have this shareholding, this debit card in your pocket, who would you like to run the oil industry in your country? Or by a rampant, profit-driven, super knowledgeable engineer from some expert country? Which of the two would you prefer as a shareholder? So the nationalization debate actually turns on its head once you think about bringing people to the reality of natural resources. Anyway, I can go forever. Let me now show you how this will look like, will not, would look like if it were to be done, which is the other thing. And the numbers I'm going to show you are fresh off the oven. The paper has not even been published, let alone, finished, let alone being published. And believe me, to calculate these numbers is no picnic. Why? Because the poverty lines obviously change across countries. The household surveys change across time. Countries have it at different points in time. The revenue coming to, the natural resource revenue coming to the country treasuries is not always transparent. Some countries report, some don't. Many of the countries that we know now have a lot of natural resources have not started exploiting them and or have given tax advantages to the companies. So the first few years, the companies don't pay taxes. This is called the first year 100% depreciation allowance. So be that as it may, it's very complex, but the question we ask is, assume that a country, or all countries, in this case in Africa, decide to give 10% of their natural resource fiscal revenue, the one that you see in the IMF numbers, 10%, uniformly and universally, meaning the same amount to every citizen. First to every citizen, rich and poor, and then only to the poor. For how many countries then will you have covered half or more of the poverty depth, the average poverty depth? I'm not saying gap. By the way, there is a methodological problem with the poverty gap because it takes into account the whole population. The poverty depth is a tighter and tougher measurement. So for how many countries distributed 10% to everybody will you cover half or more of the poverty depth, the amount of money that the average poor person needs to come out of poverty? That's what we are going to see. And it's interesting because if I get this thing to work, here we go. Now, let me show you first for half or more, you will have countries where you actually cover 100%. That's Angola, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. 10% of the revenue that is now going to these countries, distributed to everybody, meaning wasting money on the rich, if I may say that, will still do away with poverty, okay? Now, if you were to focus only on the poor, obviously the lists get longer. Then Nigeria comes in. And the Nigeria case is an interesting one because when Javier Sala Martin wrote this paper back in 2003, he took a lot of flack for this, okay? Now you can ask another question and say, well, covering half of the average poverty depth is a lot. The conditional cash transfer programs that I was mentioning before only cover 10% of the poverty depth. So why don't you use that standard? Meaning instead of poverty elimination, why don't we do poverty alleviation? And then if you were to do that and do the same calculation, the list gets a lot longer. And remember, these are countries that today receive that money. This excludes the countries that are about to receive money from natural resources. It's interesting, the list, if you focus that 10% only on the poor, is very long. And then the final question we ask is, if you were to pay only to the poor and only the amounts they need to go to the poverty line, all of them, how much money will that mean as a percentage of the natural resource revenue that these countries are now receiving? In which countries will be less than 10%? And what you see here is that, again, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon, the numbers is actually 6%. With 6% of the natural resource revenue that these countries are getting, they wipe out poverty, okay? And for the other countries, is a third or less of the natural resource revenue will be necessary. And of course, we did that for the national poverty lines, and then we applied the same thing for the international extreme poverty line, which is a $1.25 a day PPP. Now, I'm not going to get into this, but you can do exactly the same with the other big natural resource that Africa has and that the citizens don't see, that comes from the ground into the government's pockets without the citizens seeing it. And that natural resource is foreign aid. If you were to do the same with foreign aid, you get even better results. Now, down the countries are not the ones that receive a lot of oil, but the ones that receive a lot of foreign aid per capita. In those countries, you wipe out half of the poverty or the poverty depth. Here is 10%. Look at the list of 10%. Okay, and this final one shows you that the list of countries in which foreign aid is more than sufficient to end poverty is huge. No, it's more than 20 countries. Now, if you want to do that with extreme poverty line, basically it's every country. It's 25 countries in Africa. Now, why did I throw in foreign aid here, even though it was a lot of work to do it? Because we want to look into the principle, not in the number. The number is volatile, it could change. Moreover, when I say eliminate poverty or cover half of the poverty depth, it's not true. You know, there are many other reasons why you're poor. Many other things can go wrong. But if the point is to bring people into the decision around natural resources, to avoid that the bonanza that we are about to experience gets against wasted, this mechanism works. Let me stop there. My publisher, of course, told me to show you this other line, which is a book that I just published this week. He's desperate for me to sell it. So he said, could you please put that on the screen? Most of what I said is there. You can always download it. If you don't want to pay for it, just call me, I'll give you a copy. You can call me there, that's my Twitter. Thank you so much.